All right, now you may remember from Spanish 1 that we learned how to give commands. In English, of course, we give commands all the time. Do this, go here, be here, take this, for example. And we do this all the time. In Spanish, you can also give commands, and we call these mandatos. Now, in Spanish, though, there are 4 different types of commands, unlike in English. So that's going to be the subject of our video today. We're going to discuss the 4 different types of commands and kind of how they work. Now, even though there are 4 types of commands, they only ever have one form. So each command only has one form that you would use it in. So the method that we are going to look at is how to find the one form that you would use for each of these commands. The difficulty is that they don't just fall into kind of simple categories. They fall into not only formal and informal, but they also fall into affirmative and negative. Now, why is that so? Okay, let's just say, for example, that you would not use the same type of command for your boss that you would use for your children. If you wanted to offer a command to your boss, you would want to do so in a respectful manner. Well, in that situation, right, you would want to use a formal command. If you wanted to tell them not to do something as opposed to do something, then you're switching back and forth between an affirmative command, meaning go do this, as opposed to a negative command, meaning don't do that. And also, in the informal, right, you would do the exact same thing. So in an informal command scenario, you might be talking to your children or to your spouse, so you would want to use an informal and more familiar command, but you would also use the affirmative and you would also use the negative. That is to say, you would say, do this or don't do that, right? For your children, you're probably saying no all the time, whereas for your husband, you're probably constantly trying to tell him what to do. So there would be differences, right, between those different types of commands. Now, we're going to look at each of those categories. You may recall from Spanish 1 that we learned how to talk about affirmative informal commands. In your book, they're listed as affirmative tu commands. And you may remember that these were actually very simple to find. All you had to do with the affirmative tu commands is take the third person singular of the form of the verb and you had the command. So, for example, with hablar, all I have to do is find the third person singular, which is habla, and I have my command. Or with comer, all I have to do is take the third person singular and I have my command. I have come, for example. There were a couple of exceptions that we learned in this section and on this page. For example, hacer would become has, tener would become ten, and ir would become be. Now, we also learned when we were learning about informal affirmative commands that we oftentimes want to use a direct or an indirect object pronoun when discussing these commands, right? We don't just want to say go, we want to say go with me, or we want to say take this, or we want to say hold that for me. So we don't just want to use one way of talking about it, we want to also add on whatever it is that we're asking them to do, right? We don't just want to say, go sweep, we want to say sweep the floor. So we learned that when we were doing affirmative tu commands, right, or informal affirmative commands as they could be called, that we would compact that into one word together. For example, here, right, it says hazlo, meaning do that, right? Do it for me. Ténmelo, hold it for me. Vete, you go. Háblame, talk to me. Cómelo, I want you to eat it already, right? So those are ways, right, that we learned that we needed to put those direct object pronouns or indirect object pronouns directly onto the verb and form one unit, right? So these actually form one entire word, right, all together. And notice, right, that a few of them have accent marks once they create one word. For example, here, we want the emphasis to be on the verb, so there's an accent mark at the beginning of each of these verbs. Now, when we are thinking about forming affirmative formal commands or commands for usted or ustedes, this is not at all, unfortunately, the way that we would do it. We would go about in almost a completely different method. Fortunately, though, this is the same method that we will use not just to use for formal affirmative commands, but also for affirmative or for formal negative commands, and also it's the same thing that we will do for informal negative commands. So it's kind of useful that we learn all three of these together. Here, how we are going to find the formal affirmative command is we're going to take the first person singular of the verb, we are going to take off the O, and then we would add on either an A if we're using usted, or an an if we're using ustedes, or an E for usted, or an en for ustedes, but we're just going to switch which we would use, right? Normally, if we have an AR, we would use an A ending. And normally, if we have an ER, we would use an E ending. Or if we have an IR, we would use an E ending. So what we're going to do is we are going to flip that scenario. So if we have an AR verb, then in formal commands, formal affirmative commands, and also formal negative commands, we will use the opposite of that. So we can think of that as E or EN. If we have an E or an IR, then we are going to use the opposite of that, which would be an A or an AN. Here are some examples. Hablar, here's that verb in the infinitive. Hablo is the first person singular. I take off the O, and then I tack on the opposite, and since hablar is an AR verb, that would mean either an E or an EN right here. So hable or hablen. Comer would become como, and then I would take off the O and I would add on the opposite. So it would become coma or coman. Hacer, I take my first person, which is hago, I take off the O and then I add on the opposite. Since it's an ER verb, that would be an A. So it would become haga or hagan. Tener, I take my first person, which is tengo, and I take off the O, and that would become tenga or tengan, because the opposite of an ER is an A. So I would do that with all my formal affirmative commands. And that's how I would form them. And here I gave you an example of ir, right, for continuity's sake, and ir would become vaya or vayan. And I'm going to do the exact same thing that I would do with the affirmative commands with the formal commands also, right? For these affirmative, informal, I learned that I would pack it all into one word. Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing for the formal affirmative commands. All affirmative commands will become all one word. So here I say, hábleme. So I'm saying, usted hábleme. You formally talk to me. Here, cómanlo. So I used a plural there. So you eat it, right? Here, hágamelo. So you do this for me, please. But we are being formal, so that means that we are being polite in the way that we are asking for whatever it is that we need. Here's another example, téngalo and váyase, right? So these would be hold it for me and leave, please. But notice that it's a se on the end of it as opposed to a te over here, right? Because here we're using a formal, right? So we would need a se, and here we have an informal, so that one would require a te. Now, when we're going to do the formal negative commands, we're going to do that exact same thing. So we're just going to do first person singular, take off the O, and then we're going to add on the opposite ending, whether it be A or AN. So we don't have to go through this list again, but that's exactly what we would do in the negative commands. The only thing is, right, we would have a no. So instead of hable, we would have no hable, no coma, no haga, no tenga, no vaya, right? So we would always have a no attached to that, right, because we were telling someone not to do something. Now, the big thing that changes with the negatives is that unlike in the affirmatives where it all becomes one word, in the negatives you have to unpack everything and make everything an individual word, so it gets formed into a sentence basically. So we would do it just like we would do a normal sentence. So instead of saying hábleme, we would say no me hable, all separate words. Instead of saying cómanlo, I would say no lo coman. Instead of saying hágamelo, I would say no me lo haga. Instead of saying téngamelo or ténganmelo, I would say no lo tengan. Instead of saying váyase, I would say no se vaya, right? Or no se vayan. So that's the only difference with the negative and the affirmative, right? Is that you're going to have to unpack all of those phrases. Now, when I start to think about the informal negative, that's where things can get a little bit tricky because so far we're all right? We have, we have two different forms and we just need to unpack a few things. And that's not that confusing. But the informal negative can be a little confusing because it's going to follow this exact same pattern. The only difference is it's going to have an S on the end of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the first person singular, we'll take off the O, and then we're going to add an opposite just like we did with the formal commands. So we're going to choose the opposite. If it's an AR, we're going to choose ES, or IR, we're going to choose AS, and if it's an ER, we're going to choose AS, okay? So we're going to do exactly that, right? So hablar would become hablo, and then it would become no hables. Comer, first person, como, take off the O, no comas. Hacer, hago, take off the O, no hagas. Tener, tengo, take off the O, no tengas. Ir would become no vayas. And exactly like with the other negative commands, right, we would have to unpack everything that we do. So it would be no me hables, no lo comas, no lo hagas, no te vayas, right? And we would use a te here because we're talking in an informal scenario. These can be a little challenging, but to be honest, all they do is require just some practice. All right, now that we have learned all about formal and informal commands, what I would like for you to do is just practice that a little bit with all four forms that we learned using the exact same verb so that you can see how it would be used in all four forms differently. For example, here I use the word barrer, which means to sweep. If you might remember when we learned chores and household activities. Here on the front of the note card, right, I've written both forms of the informal. The affirmative formal, barre, and also the negative formal, no barras. Then on the other side, I wrote both of the formal commands, the affirmative formal command, barra or barran, depending upon whether there's one person or two people, and then also the negative command, no barra or no barran, if there's more than one person, for example. And then when you get into class, just pop it on the corkboard and I'll check it as soon as I get a moment. And as always, be prepared to share just in case I decide to call on you. Thanks, and I will see you in class.